And let me introduce Lisa Richlen, who is not from Vancouver. However, she recently moved to Vancouver, and her mother is from Vancouver, and her parents were married at Beth Israel, and she made Aliyah and spent many years in Israel. Recently finished a PhD at Ben Gurion University, and is actually a good friend of ours since Hebrew University, and is going to speak today on. Lisa, hold on a second. Abishai is calling. Can you speak to him? Sorry. And she's going to speak today on the current Israeli political system, trying to understand what's happening, as the politics in Israel is always a bit of a moving target, and so trying to understand what's happening today in Israel, and where we are in terms of the current political system. And I've been advertising it as the chaos in the current Israeli political system. And this is really part and parcel of the Hanukkah. This is one of our 3 parts of the Hanukkah story. And we actually decided that we could group this together easily with the Hanukkah program, as you may know that the Hashmonean dynasty lasted for 103 years. And really one of the reasons of the collapse of the Hashmonean dynasty was political infighting, including opportunities and taking and desires to expand territory, and the debate over whether or not to expand territory in the Hashmonean dynasty. So that was 2100 years ago, and sometimes it seems as though there's nothing new in the news. So with that, I want to pass the proverbial torch over to Lisa.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. So before I start, a couple of disclaimers. One is that I started working for CJA today. So anything I say is me personally. I'm not here as a representative of CJA. The other disclaimer, the other thing I wanted to tell you is that for almost 12 years, I've worked for an Arab Palestinian member of the Knesset. So he actually was in the Knesset from 2015 until this spring. I'm not going to specifically speak about the Arab parties and their politics, although I can certainly answer plenty of questions about that. But I did want you to know that since 2010, I've worked for someone who served in the Knesset in the Hadash faction, which is a part of the majority Arab Joint List. And also I'm a little bit sick, so if I cough a little bit or something, I apologize in advance. And finally, I didn't manage to print out my notes, so I'm going to be looking at my notes instead of you for part of it, but hopefully that won't be too much of a problem.
So don't worry, we all have to be vaccinated to come to Beth Israel, so we should be fine.
And because I came from Israel, I got 3 shots of Pfizer before I got to Canada. So I think I'm set with the vaccination. But this is definitely cold. It's not COVID. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of Israel's political system. I'll talk a little bit about the previous election cycles that we went through. I'll talk a bit about why it came about now that we have what's this quote unquote change government after many failed attempts to put together a government, and what the implications are for policy, and particularly for religious pluralism in Israel. That's my agenda. And Jonathan, if when I have 5 minutes left or something, I don't think I'll go over, but you can tell me if I'm running out of time. Okay, so first I want to talk a little bit about Israel's political system. Israel has a coalition system. So I think it's like Canada, where, we vote for a party. We don't vote for someone who represents our district. For example, if I was voting in the United States, and whichever party gets the most votes, their leader has the first shot at forming the government. that leader, generally speaking, would be prime minister if they manage to form the government. Now, what does it mean to form the government? Israel has a very fractious, many different parties. It's a coalition system. In order to form a government, you need to come up with a platform and have many parties sign on this joint platform in the government. So it's a lot of negotiation and horse trading and this kind of thing. But that's the way the system works. And so if the head of the largest party is not able to form a government, then we go back to elections. So in Israel, like I said, we don't vote for a specific representative who represents our district. We vote for a party. So, and Israel is very, our former President Richlen would call it tribal. Israel's very, you could say collective. There are many different interest groups in Israel. So people tend to vote for the party that they feel that represents them either religiously or ideologically. And what that means is that you can have many different parties. Each one has a very different agenda, and each one is only beholden to its specific sector in Israeli society. So there's no real motivation for members of Knesset in parties to come up with like a kind of agenda that would appeal to a wide variety of people. Rather, there's a motivation for them to come up with a very sectorally specific agenda. So that, makes it much harder in some ways that makes, everything a little bit more extreme in terms of trying to come to any kind of agreement. It also means that for me as the voter, there's no accountability. I don't have an address. I don't have a specific person. I work for Yusuf, for 12 years. I mostly haven't voted for him. But I have more influence over him, for example, because I work with him for him than I would have for, a party that I would probably be more likely to vote for example. Okay. So what this means in the coalition system is that this gives smaller parties a lot of influence. So usually we see this in terms of the ultra-Orthodox parties, where you absolutely have to include them in order to come up with a coalition. And that means that they can kind of force a lot of their policies onto the entire Israeli public because they're in the coalition. So that's why we have a situation in Israel where Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox Jewish norms tend to dominate, because those parties tend to be deal breakers in coalitions, and whatever it is they want tends to happen in terms of the government. Am I being clear? I'm not sure if I am explaining myself well enough. Or yeah, Jonathan, do you think I'm being okay? Okay, so that's why we have basically. Also, Israel, of course, doesn't have any separation between religion and state. So that's why traditionally the ultra-Orthodox have had to be in these coalitions to make a government, and that's why they've had outsized influence in terms of pushing their agenda on the vast majority of Israeli Jews who are not ultra-Orthodox. Okay, so Netanyahu, who I will call Bibi, served from 2009 until this past June. He was the longest serving prime minister Israel has ever had. He served longer than David Ben-Gurion. So, the last thing I want to say is that each election cycle is very expensive. Okay, because for us, it's a vacation day. We don't have to work on election days. I went to IKEA once on one of those elections. That was a huge mistake because the entire country was at IKEA. But it doesn't matter. First of all, there's a loss of productivity because no one works. And secondly, all of the parties get funding to promote their agendas, to advertise, etc. So, so it's just each election is a hugely expensive proposition. So that's something that's important to know in terms of like how we're thinking about that. Okay, so Israel had 4 elections in 2 years. The first one was April 9th, 2019. The second was September 17th, 2019. The third was March 2nd, 2020, and the fourth was March 23rd of this past year. Now, why did we have so many elections? First of all, let's think about the coalition system and the blocks, okay? Is the Israeli political map didn't change between those different elections. All of the, the people who voted for Likud in the first election voted for Likud, which is Netanyahu's party, in the last election for the most part. I can tell you exactly, okay? Likud got 35 mandates or 35 seats. The Knesset's 120 seats. You need 61 to form a majority, to form a coalition. So in the first election, Likud got 35. In the second election, Likud got 32. In the third election, 36. And in the fourth election, 30. Okay, so, and the same was true more or less. There were some variations, and there were some startup parties like Blue and White and Yesh Atid kind of rose and fell, but fell in the joint list as well. They got up to 16 seats. In the last election, they were down to 6, which is why Yusuf is no longer in the Knesset. But in general, the blocks that between right and left remained the same, and they remained about equal, right? So that is why it was so hard all of those years to come up with a coalition. So generally, it seemed like the most promising, the most promising way would be Likud. Oh, and the party who gets the most votes, of course, has the first shot creating a government. So that was usually Likud, and they would bring along the usual suspects, the ultra-Orthodox parties, the kind of right-wing national religious parties, Shas, Lieberman's party, Yisrael Beitenu, and then in order to get to a coalition, to try to bring in some of the more centrist parties like Blue and White or Yesh Atid or whatever. But in general, the balance between center left and say right was the same. So that is why it was very hard to come up with a coalition. Now we can and to sign on a coalition agreement. So you can keep having, it's what's that expression? The definition of idiocy is to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. And we all felt that way. We all felt this is ridiculous. We're being dragged through all of these elections. We're not expecting any different result. The Israeli populace is the same Israeli populace. And a lot of us felt that, this was a strategy for Bibi to stay in power, because as long as there was no government, they couldn't pass any legislation. And he wanted to continue. There were some issues around passing legislation that would give him immunity. And so, the fact that in the background to all of these elections, Israel's most dominant political leader has this kind of these legal cases hanging over him also raised, I think, a lot of questions around why are we being dragged to elections so many times, and how do his personal interests, play into the political realm that we were seeing. So that was a big question that people had. And we got really sick of not having a government. Okay, when you don't have a government, you can't pass any legislation. The reason the last government fell is because there was no budget. Because, there was a coalition agreement that they were supposed to come up with a budget, and in the end they didn't. And, it's not important who blamed who and who broke the coalition agreement. But if you don't have a budget, state institutions can't function. A budget is essential for stability in the Israeli political system. That is why in early November, when Israel passed a budget in this change government, it was a huge deal. Huge, because it was a huge litmus test for the government and the government's ability to weather conflict and to be sustainable. So not having a government also, it makes governance hard. It was problematic from the perspective of citizens. There was a lot, these elections and this whole, a lot of the rhetoric, certainly from my perspective, but I think that, if you look at objectively before and after, there was a lot of politics of division, a lot of you're anti-Israel, you're this, you're that, a lot of kind of name calling. It was a very kind of divisive rhetoric around these elections. which you know, where for myself personally, but I think for many of us, we felt like, you know, like the political rhetoric was not around unity. It was very much around like who's acceptable, who's not acceptable, who's, you know, who's pro-Israel, who's not pro-Israel. I on this in this scenario fell on the not pro-Israel side. So some of us certainly felt like, you know, we're sick of having this kind of rhetoric around division, and we really wanted different government. And I should say one other thing, which I think really precipitated the fact that we have a change government now, is that, I mean, let's be honest, all of these other what are they called? These other politicians who would like to have a shot at having some power and influence, we're sick of Bibi. You know, because like, how did he stay in power? He used a lot of strategies that, you know, a lot of I don't know. I don't want to like just, I know there might be some people here who support Netanyahu, but there was a lot of, but you know, people have seen him for 10 years. And there was a lot of like promises made and that weren't kept. And, you know, Bibi, I think part of the reason he was able to maintain power is because he basically chopped down all of his rivals within his own party, by the way. And many of those, that's why Gidon Sar and some of these other people split off, because they saw that they couldn't compete with him from within Likud, but also outside of Likud. If you're talking about Lieberman, I think was really sick of just having to negotiate with the same guy over and over again. And I think it's, you know, I think someone like Bennett as well, people who consistently sat with him in a coalition felt like, you know, we've had it with this guy. We need a change. We need, you know, we need to see new people in positions of leadership. So I think that there was really just the sense of like exhaustion, like also on the part of many people in the Israeli public, that we need a change. We're just really kind of sick of like the status quo. So so what happened to precipitate the change government? Bibi failed to form a government, okay, after these March or April, these last elections. Some people believe that, many of us believed that the war in May, right as the war took place, the opposition was almost about to sign an agreement. And about 4 days after the war started, that agreement was off the table because there was a war going on. So you're talking about politics when there's a war going on. So a lot of us, you know, felt that like there was some connection here between the war in May and what was going on in terms of trying to set up a government. So you know, I think that like many people believe that the opposite, after 10 years of seeing the same person in power, you start to believe that there really is no alternative, that this is what there is. And, you know, I think that you know, people were so ready to put us, I would really have to say that Yair Lapid, in my view, is really the one who enabled this change government to take place, because his party had the second biggest amount of mandates. He was the one who should have been prime minister. And instead, he put aside his ego and he said to Bennett, whose party only had has six mandates, has 6 seats in Knesset, you go first and I'll make you prime minister. He made him an offer he couldn't refuse, right? If you look objectively at the political map, Bennett didn't have enough support to be prime minister. But like I said, I think people like Lapid and Bennett were ready for a change and we're ready for something different. And even though many people called Bennett and people in his party traitors because they sat with people on the other side of the political map, in the end, they agreed to sign this agreement. And Lapid, like I said, agreed to, you know, delay gratification and wait 2 years until his turn comes as prime minister. And that is the main breakthrough that allowed this government to go forward. So yeah, like I said, there's a rotation agreement. So after 2 years, Lapid is meant to be prime minister. Right now, he's Minister of Foreign Affairs. And on the 2nd of June, a coalition agreement was signed between Yesh Atid, Blue and White, Yamina, the Labor Party, Yisrael Beitenu, New Hope, Meretz, the United Arab List, which is Ram. So if we look at this list, you know, Yesh Atid, Blue and White are basically centrist in the Israeli political arena. Yamina is more of a kind of right-wing party. Labor is left-wing. Yisrael Beitenu is right-wing politically, but kind of more left-wing on social issues. New Hope basically was a break-off from Likud, so kind of a right-wing party. Meretz, which is left-wing, and the United Arab List, which is an Arab party. Now, so we can see that this coalition contains both parties from the left and parties from the right, and an Arab Palestinian party. So that is significant to what I am going to say next. But first I want to say about the fact that Ram, which is the United Arab List, is in the Knesset. The Arab parties have never, ever been part of a ruling coalition. The closest they came to having any influence in government was in the 90s during the Rabin era, during the signing of the Oslo agreements, where they were outside the coalition, but they were considered to be a blocking majority. The reason why Rabin was able to pass Oslo in the Knesset was because the Arab party supported it. So many Jewish parties and many Israeli Jews said Oslo has no legitimacy because it wouldn't have passed were it not for the Arab parties. So the fact that Ram is in the coalition is very significant. On the other hand, I mean, I could speak a lot about what this means and why they're in the Knesset, and in the past they haven't. In addition to the fact that why this particular party, they broke off from the other three who continue to be the joint list. They broke off and became a separate party. And they took a much more pragmatic approach around, first of all, they represent a lot of Bedouin in the Negev. They took a much more pragmatic approach around just economic development and kind of put a lot of ideological issues aside. And that seemed to work for them. I mean, I could give you a lot of commentary about what that means within the Arab Palestinian community, but we can talk about that in the questions if you're interested. So this was historic that Ram is in the government. And because they're in the government, they have all sorts of conditions around home demolitions and investment and issues around building and planning and things that are very particular to the Arab Palestinian community in Israel. The other thing that's important about this coalition is that it does not include the Haredim. It doesn't include the ultra-Orthodox. Now, the ultra-Orthodox always believed that only Bibi could form a government. And Bibi, I think, even had them sign an agreement saying that they would not go with any other coalition. So I don't really think that they believed that a government would actually be created without them. I personally don't remember a time where there were no ultra-Orthodox parties, including Shas, in the government. So this is like historic that there are no, and that has all sorts of implications for issues around religion and state. The other reason, in addition to that, the other reason they probably would not be willing to join this coalition is that Yair Lapid of Yesh Atid and particularly his father, have his now deceased father, have very strong reputation being anti-ultra-Orthodox. And what was the other thing I was going to say? And Lieberman, Israel Beitenu. So Israel Beitenu, or Israel's Our Home, is largely a Russian-speaking, largely appeals to Russian speakers. And if you think about, a lot of them came and they're not to Israel, and they're not halakhically Jewish, and they can't get married. And so there are a lot of those voters as well. And so, like I said, Israel Beitenu tends to, on one hand, be right-wing security-wise, but on the other hand, be more kind of left-wing around social issues. And a lot of that comes up around issues of conversion, civil marriage, issues around religion and state. So that was the other thing that would have made it uncomfortable for the ultra-Orthodox to sit in this particular coalition. Of course, they're very angry at parties like Yamina, which claim to be religious, because they're basically Orthodox or national religious, for kind of selling out and sitting with the leftists and sitting with all these people who are quote unquote anti-Jewish or anti-ultra-Orthodox. Okay, so we have now a coalition that consists of right and left-wing parties. So what does that mean? Right? Because everything in Israel is so contentious, right? I worked in human rights. So, what does that mean for issues of refugees? What does that mean for people who want to see a two-state solution or don't like building in the territories? What does that mean for right-wing, right-wing issues? I can't think of any at the moment because they've been in government so long. But, for people who want to annex, for example, the territories, right? Which is more of a right-wing kind of political, agenda item. So anything that's like very right or left, that in this coalition, you can't advance it because you have a coalition of right and left. So there's no annexation, but there's going to be no peace process. It also means that any kind of contentious issue that doesn't have full social support, like I worked a lot on behalf of asylum seekers, because in Israel they don't get refugee status, which is why I'm calling them asylum seekers. Anyway, none of those agendas are going to be advanced because that's a left-wing agenda. We have a government that's both left and right together. So it means that anyone who's in this coalition, any of these issues that are strongly aligned with either the left or the right, they're going to have to put those agendas aside. They're not going to be advanced in the context of this coalition. But it means that this coalition can focus on pragmatic, centrist, or mainstream issues, as I termed it in my notes. So what are those? Funding for education and healthcare, fighting coronavirus, trying to work to advance the economy, working to invest in the periphery in Israel outside of, Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and some of where there's underinvestment in the north and the Negev, issues of public security, issues of social welfare. Okay, normally these issues would become right or left issues, but this is an opportunity to try to look at some of these social issues, which usually get overshadowed by contentious political debates around religion and state or human rights or issues around, settling the territories or something like this. Usually you don't hear about these issues, right? Until like the doctors go on strike or the teachers go on strike or anything like this. But because these can be more mainstream, non-controversial issues, in this change coalition, there can be some movement, some advancement of these issues. It also means that there can be some like small reforms, right? Like there's small reforms around healthcare. Oh, it also, let me put it this way. It means that so you have, for example, Nitzan Horowitz, who's Merit, it's a left-wing party. He's the Minister of Health. So he can do certain things within that realm that wouldn't have happened prior to this coalition. For example, they're drawing up a plan to give asylum seekers health care. One of the first decisions he made is that Israel had, vaccines that were going to expire. So he said, let's send them to the Palestinian territories. If it had been someone on the right, they wouldn't have agreed to, if it had been a right-wing, center-right coalition, they wouldn't have proposed those things. But they're small enough reforms and they're enough within his purview, within his sphere of influence, that he can kind of decide on his own. It's not too explosive. Same with now Merav Michaeli, he's Minister of Transport. So she's trying to promote public transportation on Shabbat. I doubt she's going to be successful, but and it's the same on the right. Okay, so on the other hand, you have Ayelet Shaked, who's the Minister of Interior, and is again talking about deporting asylum seekers. So each side can kind of they can't make any big changes, but within their own ministries and their spheres of influence, they can talk about smaller kinds of issues that that are important to them, and maybe make some kind of smaller changes. So that's one thing that it means. Okay, so let's talk about religion and state. I think I'm going to finish early, and hopefully that's okay. Okay, so the current situation is that the Minister of Religious Affairs is an Orthodox Jew, modern Orthodox. He was a career military person. So what does that mean? It means on one hand, he's religious. Okay, he's not ultra-Orthodox, modern Orthodox. But it also means that he spent most of his professional life in secular frameworks. Okay, so he knows how to speak to the secular public. He understands the importance of the diaspora. He's not someone who's going to say it has to be a certain kind of halacha, any way you look at it. He's someone who will. There was a long interview with him in the Times of Israel. David Horowitz interviewed him, so I'll be happy to send the link if any of you want to read it, where he kind of outlines what his views are. But it means that he kind of lives in the real world, right? He's going to try to find some balance between his worldview and a more secular worldview. The ultra-Orthodox, of course, don't like that at all, because anytime you start talking about concessions towards Reform or conservative Jews or the Kotel, the Western Wall Agreement, or anything like this, they find it very threatening, particularly when it's someone who claims to be an Orthodox Jew, who identifies as an Orthodox Jew, making those kinds of comments. But that's who we have. So, like I said, because the Haredim are not in government, there's a chance to make some movement on religion and state issues. So I mentioned public transportation on Shabbat. It seems that I have to say that so far nothing is final. And until they passed the budget in early November, it was really hard to even think about focusing in any concerted way on these issues. But the issues that they're talking about are public transportation on Shabbat, which seems unlikely that there's going to be significant progress here. Civil marriage also seems kind of unlikely from what I'm reading, that there's going to be significant movement here. Okay, the Kotel, the Western Wall. So we know that there was an agreement with the conservative and reform movements about having an egalitarian space. In the end, the agreement was put off the table. Let's see, there was an agreement in 2016 after years of negotiation with diaspora leaders, but then it was frozen in 2017 because of the ultra-Orthodox parties. So now the government is looking to revive it. Just today, there is an article in the Times of Israel about how Herzog, the president, met with the leaders of the Reform Conservative movement to discuss this. Now the president doesn't have any real power, but it's still a symbolic move that he's trying to go likrat, as we say. He's trying to do something, to recognize something that he knows is important to these movements. And the last time there was a Women of the Wall prayer at the Kotel, the police did a much better job protecting them and enforcing against the ultra-Orthodox protesters than we've seen in the past. So that seems to indicate that the government has something of a different outlook towards liberal streams of Judaism and is maybe less concerned in this particular moment about what the ultra-Orthodox think or what they might do. So that could advance. Right. He just made a bunch of statements, you know, that Herzog when he met today with or yesterday with non-Orthodox movements. Okay, kashrut. So again, because there's no separation of religion and state, so kashrut has been exclusively determined until recently by the ultra-Orthodox. Many people complain that the system is inefficient, that it's inconsistent, that there's a lot of corruption. It's also very expensive. Restaurants can pay a lot of money to maintain an ultra-Orthodox tuda, like a standard, like a certificate. It's not always clear what they're getting for that money. A lot of restaurants felt that like, oh, and for example, they won't issue one if you're open on Shabbat, even if all your food is kosher. So a lot of restaurant owners really didn't like the system. They felt that it was unfair. They felt that they were funding a system that, you know, isn't in their interest and that doesn't work properly. What else did I write here? They use different standards, the poor employment conditions for inspectors. There's no competition as well. So there have been different initiatives to try to break down the monopoly of the ultra-Orthodox. The most significant one's called Hashgacha Pratit. I actually know quite well the person who founded this initiative. It's called Aaron Leibowitz. He lives in my former neighborhood. Anyway, so what they would do is issue like an alternative. It even went to the Supreme Court because the ultra-Orthodox didn't like Hashgacha Pratit. They said, you're claiming that you're giving kashrut and only certificate and only we can do that. So, but they would go to different restaurants and they would give like their little certificate. And in the end, the Supreme Court said, as long as it does not say kosher on the certificate, we are saying that, you know, you can give this certificate to restaurants. So already there was some breakdown of the hegemony of the power of the ultra-Orthodox in the sphere of kashrut because of Hashgacha Pratit and because a lot of the restaurant owners, you know, went in that direction, right? It's not enough that you have Hashgacha Pratit, you know, it's the restaurants also have to agree, and enough of them felt that like, this is good enough for us. We like the service better. It's cheaper. We feel like it's not going to cut into our, you know, client base too much. Like I would go, for example, many of my friends would go, who keep kosher, would go somewhere that has Hashgacha Pratit, you know, because even if they're open on Shabbat, like the food is kosher. They don't need a badatz. They don't need like the most stringent standards. So already there was some change there, and this, I think, is only the current government proposal. So that the current government has actually put together a proposal to break down the monopoly of the kashrut supervisors. And what they're proposing is a series of private agencies, which are supervised by municipal rabbis and the chief rabbi. So the idea is to basically create competition, okay, to make the system more efficient. And I have a feeling that that proposal is probably going to end up passing. In other words, there probably is going to be significant reform in the area of kashrut. And conversion, also, there could very well be significant reform here. The proposal on the table now is to give more authority to municipal rabbis and allowing them to conduct conversions. Right, but it's not, none of these things that have passed yet. So we'll have to wait and see what is going to happen. So anyway, that was that's what I prepared. I think I was supposed to go maybe a little bit longer, but hopefully that is sufficient. I'm happy to continue, of course.
By the way, Lisa, no one has ever complained to me that I went too short. So thank you. Great introduction. Great explanation. Thank you. Anyone have any questions? I don't think Lisa said anything too controversial that we need to have written questions. I think we can take them verbally.
I hope I didn't say anything too controversial.
Not at all.
Okay.
Does anyone have any?
I didn't want to come across as being like anti-right wing or anti-religious. I was trying to be,
No.
fair.
Does anyone have any questions for Lisa? I have two questions.
Okay.
Number one is, and I know that you're not a prophet, even though you're a friend of ours, but um, do you do you do you think, first of all, do you think that the current government is viable? Will it last throughout the, and then related to that is, do you actually see the transfer of power taking place, or do you see someone trying to call a new election before the transfer of power actually happens?
Well, like I said, the passage of the budget, you never know in Israeli politics ever, right? So no one should ever like hold me to my word. But the passage of the budget was a big test for this government, huge, and they passed it. So that's the first thing, that builds trust within the different coalition members. And I think that the conditions, that brought this change government together to come to fruition haven't changed. People still don't want to see another election. They still want to see a different kind of discourse. The other thing I would say for this government is that I think that there are good relationships between Bennett, Lapid, Saar, Lieberman, some of the bigger parties. And I think they respect each other. They want to help each other. They want to work together. And I think that is going to help the government to be viable. I also think that, none of them are career politicians. I mean, I personally know someone whose wife is Lapid's wife's very best friend, right? Like, he always voted Meretz, and he, totally is on the Yesh Atid bandwagon because like Lapid's a family for like they, hang out together, right? So he has a lot. So, I think that we're talking about a person who has a lot of integrity from Lapid's side, okay? And I think Bennett came from the world of high tech. He's religious, but he lives in Renana. He's not living in the settlements, okay? He comes from a secular environment. So I think that so he's not a career politician in the sense of like, a power hungry. No one would have ever believed in the elections in March that he would be prime minister. Like that just seems even today kind of inconceivable. There was someone who pointed out, I'm going a little bit on a tangent here, but recently there was a couple that was arrested in Turkey because they took a picture outside of, I don't know, the house of like the prime minister or something like this. And they came back to Israel, and if it had been Bibi, he would have like greeted them at the airport, like a photo op. He would have used this like a photo op opportunity. And we don't see that kind of like grandstanding, that kind of like bombastic, like Bennett's much more sensitive to public opinion. People were like, what, you're closing the borders, and you yourself, your family is going on vacation to a country in Africa. How can you do that? He said, no, we're a regular citizen. We canceled that vacation. We're going to a country that, is on the acceptable list. So I think that like the fact that we have a political echelon who aren't really politicians in the normal sense of the word, who aren't the kind of politicians that we're used to seeing, will also help them, who really see themselves more as a shlichat tzibur, like public servants, I think will help this government to be somewhat more sustainable.
There's a question on the floor, if that if there is a single politician in the country who you think could really unite the country and we could see as a prime minister at some point down the road.
I don't think anyone could really unite the country. I mean, Israel's way too divided. But I do think that certain people can politicians have and do use discourse that's more uniting. And we need to create a political climate that encourages that. And the current political climate, the current political constellation does more to encourage that. I will say about Richlen, I really feel that he was a very uniting figure. He was, of course, never prime minister, and he was then president, and now he's retired. So he's not someone who would, and anyone also who would be in that position of a prime minister, like Bennett, is under tremendous pressure from his voting public to, I mean, like they got death threats, and, it was a difficult position for them to be in because people felt that they went back on their election promises and compromise their morals and stuff. So I think just by virtue of the fact of being a national leader, it's hard to take a nuanced center position. But you can certainly create a climate. The fact that there are left and right wing parties in the government now means that you can't say stuff like the left is, like the stuff we used to hear, that like the left is, what's like boged, like not traitorous, but like not loyal, and not Israeli enough, and not Zionist, and all of this stuff. Like you wouldn't hear that discourse. You also wouldn't hear discourse around anti-Russian speakers, or it's just a completely different, it creates a completely different dynamic when you have all of these parties together in government.
Do you think likewise? Do you think that I asked if you thought that we'd come to an election? Do you think maybe that we'll see the success of the next 2 years and then an election that actually brings about the same situation? Do people like the situation enough that they'd like to see a replay of it actually?
Oof, I don't know. After this government is over in 4 years from now, assuming that it runs out its term, it's hard to say. I think if people feel that their economic situation is good and the security situation is good, I think that it could conceivably happen again. But there are always spoilers. There are always going to be people in the extremes that are going to try to derail something like this. So yeah, I see. So it's hard to say. But yeah, I think it could conceivably. Israeli politics is unpredictable and dynamic. So what happened for 10 years, you could see a radical change that is more sustainable. Yeah, I think so. Norman?
Yes. The Arab parties are part of the coalition. What concessions were granted to the Arab parties to become part of the coalition?
So only one of the 4 Arab parties is part of the coalition. That is the rub. The other 3 are outside of the coalition. Okay, the joint list is not in the coalition. Hadash, Tal, and Balad, which make up the joint list, are not, and they are the Arab mainstream voice. Okay, Ram is an outlier. The Arab party that's in the coalition is an outlier. And what Abbas of Ram did is he said, we're not going to talk about the occupation and the Palestinian situation. We're not going to talk about, ideological issues of the status of the Arab minority in Israel, as, Yusuf would talk about, who's in the Hadash party of the joint list. He's, like I say, he's not in Knesset now, but like he was for the last 5 years or so. So he said, we're going to not talk about any of those ideological issues. We're only going to talk about very pragmatic issues that affect our daily life: building and planning, violence, economic development for the Negev, stuff that's like very concrete. So, a lot of Arab Palestinians feel that he sold out, ideologically. But a lot of his voters, but he now has, of course, what's the word? I can't think of the word I'm trying to think of, but he has a lot of influence now because, if he leaves the coalition, like there's no coalition, right? The 61. So they need him. They need to keep him happy. But yeah, he traded ideological concessions. He traded ideology for pragmatic considerations. And it seems to have paid off. And it will help the entire Arab community in Israel. Because, they just passed this huge budget for investment. It's an extension of a previous program the government had. But yeah, so it's a controversial move. And long-term, it's not clear. It will probably make him more popular, I think, in the Arab community.
Thank you.
Len and then Joel.
Okay, Lisa, thank you for the presentation. It was really great. I have a question. Maybe you could pass a comment about it. I read in the news today where Tel Aviv is the most expensive city in the world.
I'm so glad you brought this up. All of the Israelis are gloating about this. And every time someone in Vancouver says to me, you would not believe the cost of rent in this city, I am just thinking to myself, you have no idea. Sorry about that. I just had to get that off my chest.
So, yeah, do you have any idea what's behind that?
Well, it's something we've all known in Israel. It's just an extension of the previous economic situation. I mean, Israel's extremely expensive. Salaries are low. I don't think this is new. You know, the exact ranking might be a little bit different. There, you know, the shekel is very strong right now, so I think that could be part of it. But Tel Aviv is always, and you know, Jerusalem is not far behind. So any of these cities in the center. You know, have always been very, very high on the cost of living index. So, so there's really nothing new here. There's a lot of pressure on the previous government, on this government, to lower the cost of housing. In 2011, we had these huge protests around cottage cheese, but it was really a lot about the cost of housing. So, so yeah.
If you keep in mind that a cup of coffee that I would never buy because it's yucky goes for, I think, for like 15 to 20 shkalim. Is that right, roughly?
Like aromas, maybe 12. Yeah, it could be like 12 or 15.
12 to 15, and the shekel is at 40 cents to the Canadian dollar right now. But you know, if it were at 25 cents, it's one thing. But when it's at 40 cents, it makes cost of living very expensive.
You know, it's not only about what things cost; it's about what the salaries are.
Exactly.
People always forget that I'm paying, you know, the rents here are equivalent to what I paid in Jerusalem. And, you know, I would get more here, and I'm earning more here. I have the possibility of earning more here.
Don't tell
certain
that.
things here are more expensive, like having a car or food. Fruits and vegetables are more expensive, but it doesn't make up the difference between, I mean, still, you know, I still can earn more here.
So Joel, please. Joel, can you unmute? You had a question, didn't you?
No, I didn't.
Okay. Any other questions? Oh, I thought you had raised your hand. Any other questions? Yes, Arnold. Oh, Arnold, I accidentally muted you. I apologize. Can you unmute again? Perfect, thanks. Nope, unmute again, yeah.
Okay. My question, I read today, I believe, where there's thought of making the vaccine compulsory in Israel, having the all vaccinations, the 3 vaccinations compulsory. Have you heard anything in that direction?
I think the person who said that said explicitly that he does not represent the view of the Israeli government. So I don't think it's going to happen. I think that this government's trying to use a lot of carrots, and really encourage people to go voluntarily and get vaccinated. There's a lot of rhetoric, a lot of positive rhetoric. I feel like in my experience in the BB years, it was a lot of lockdowns, a lot of very drastic moves. I think this government is trying much more to take a softer approach to looking at how to deal with the virus. But I don't think they're going to make it compulsory. It's very hard to make Israelis do anything they don't want to do.
Oh, sorry. I was just I didn't realize I was on a mute. I was going to say that.
Yeah. Oh, I'm glad it got a good reception. Israelis don't like rules. I like to say that laws in Israel are like suggestions, guidelines, recommendations.
That reminds me of my favorite joke, but I'll tell it later. Actually, it's about this season. I told you recently, but anyway, Lisa, any other last questions for Lisa? So we want to thank Lisa. So the time just flew by. It's hard to believe that we're already almost 8:30. So thank you, and thank you for bringing your treasure of knowledge and wisdom and insight with you to Vancouver. And we look forward to learning again with you in the future. And hopefully the stability of the moment will bring peace for generations, and we won't go the way of the Hashmoneans, who the ongoing infighting was exceedingly problematic. I want to take a moment to just advertise the upcoming speaker series that we have, if I can. And I am in, oh, that is not what I wanted to show you. I want to go to here. This is, can everyone see my screen? So we are in, next week is the BI AGM, but the week after that, we start a brand new series entitled Making a Life of Meaning. It's called Making a Life of Meaning, Making the Most of Time. And the first session is going to be with David Zvi Kalman, who works for the Hartman Institute and did his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania on technology and time. And how technology, specifically clocks and telling time, has affected life, in specifically both actually halakha and Muslim law. He's going to focus just on technology and time, the life on the clock. And then that's in 2 weeks. And then on January 12th, we have Rabbi Elena Zeeman joining us. You may remember her from High Holidays. And she has recently published a book, and she's going to be speaking on deepen, heal, and uplift the relationships that matter to you the most while you still can. And for those of you who heard my sermon on Shabbat, you know that that's extremely relevant. So, and finally, the last one will be designing a practical blueprint for creating a meaningful life with Mary Jo Barrett, who is a psychologist in Chicago and pretty active Jewishly, and always teaches at Rabbi Camp, where hopefully I will be in January. And we want to thank Bob for sponsoring that series in memory of Ralph and Ron. So again, I want to say thank you to Lisa for her excellent presentation. We want to wish her a refuah shlema. And I have just one last question for you, going back to talking about Ram and the Arab Party, yeah, which of course is the fascinating piece, I think, of it is, if I'm correct, he's rather socially conservative, right?
He's Muslim. It's a Muslim party.
Yeah, and
I mean, they're all Muslim, but he's
more
it's an
socially
Islamicist political party.
So he's more socially conservative than maybe the person for whom you worked. I don't know if that's true. Is that?
Well, Yusuf is from Al-Fahim, which is quite Islamic, but he's also in the Hadash party, which has a liberal agenda within the, it's, you know, it's always important to remind people that the Arab Palestine community, which is what they call themselves, they don't call themselves Arab Israelis, that they're not a monolith, that there are different ideologies, religious, you know, orientations, etc. So, but yes, Hadash is the more progressive party in terms of women's rights and kind of liberal values.
So has that affected the, is the fact that he is on the right-wing conservative traditional side in terms of his Islamic take, does that affect his politics and maybe his acceptance by the right wing of the Jewish Israeli community, or not?
No, I don't think it makes I don't think Jewish Israelis know very much about what his agenda is. But what it does mean is that, for example, you know, he's very anti-homosexual. So you have him sitting in a government with Meretz, right? Nissan Horowitz is gay, the head of Meretz, the Minister of Health. So it, you know, again, you know, there aren't going to be a lot of developments when it comes to rights for gays and lesbians in this government, right? Because he's there, and you have Yamina there, and then you have, you know, the more liberal Jewish parties. But again, I think that all of those ideological, and keep in mind, he mostly got votes from the Bedouin who serve in the Israeli army. I think a lot of the, you know, so in some ways are more within the Israeli mainstream. He put aside all those ideological agendas, again, for purely pragmatic calculations around budgets, around changing laws that don't work for the Arab community, like building and planning is a huge issue. Infrastructure, recognition of unrecognized villages in the Negev, just very, very practical socioeconomic kind of fundamental quality of life issues. All that ideology, whether it's Islamic or, you know, political in the sense of Israel-Palestine, he threw that out the door and said, we live here, we've been in this state since 1948, we need to have basic socioeconomic development, and that is our agenda. So that is what allowed him to enter this coalition. And like I said, it seems to be working because you know, they are getting these kinds of funding concessions that otherwise maybe probably wouldn't have happened.
Excellent. Thank you. We appreciate it.
Thank you,
Excellent.
Jonathan.
My pleasure.